right, what I thought I would do, since we did start with the first couple of chapters, first 4 or 5 lectures of Rudolf Steiner's Fifth Gospel, it actually got me thinking about the other 4 Gospels, and going through them is something that was a project that a couple of years back I had started upon and had gotten as far as going through Akhenaten and Gilgamesh, and then was getting ready to cover the Maccabean Revolt to move into the Gospels. And I figured that since Steiner did a lecture cycle on each of the 4 Gospels, that it might be a good idea to go back through them first via his lectures on them, because I think they're quite illuminating and interesting and also refreshing. As always with Steiner, originality is his stock in trade. You're always going to get fresh ideas from him that you won't hear anyone else talk about. For instance, as we'll see, he discusses the Gospels in light of the idea of reincarnation. Who has been reincarnated as what, from when? Which is a totally fresh light, because Steiner is one of the very few individuals in the West who takes, one of the great thinkers in the West who takes reincarnation seriously. So you're not going to get that from pretty much anybody else. So now Steiner says in these opening 2 lectures in the Gospel of Mark, which was given a year earlier than the Fifth Gospel, the Gospel of Mark was given in around September 23rd, 24th, 20th, right in that week there, in 1912, as he was completely disaffected with the Theosophists and was in the process of breaking from them. And you can tell that by every now and then he'll throw a barb at the Theosophists. He makes a comment here about their ridiculous idea that Christ could ever be reincarnated. Christ is a one-time only event. That's the whole point of the incarnation for him. And so what he does is he says, if we look at the Old Testament as a whole, it really should conclude with the 2 books of the Maccabees, which are left out as apocryphal texts. The King James Version does not include them, but they really should be put in. They form a perfect climax to the Old Testament, and they should be put in after all the books of the prophets. It ends currently, I think, with Malachi, the prophet Malachi, which does form a transition, as we'll see, to the Gospel of Mark, which is the oldest of the 4. And the Maccabean Revolt, Steiner talks about. Now, the Maccabean Revolt is a very significant event, since it represents a boundary act, what I call a boundary act, which is a term that I've invented or coined in order to describe how one culture resists being gobbled up by another culture. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. Really, the Maccabean Boundary Act was only temporarily successful, but in essence was not. This is part of the Judeo-Christian Islamic Magian civilization that Spengler calls the Arabian or the Magian civilization, and it was left up to Islam to pick up from where the Maccabees left off and do the revolt over again and get it done correctly this time, which is to say, Spengler's idea of a pseudomorphosis is what happens when you get the influence of one culture that lies so heavily over the land that a nascent or newborn culture underneath it cannot express itself except through the alien form language. So that Spengler says we get the first mosque in the Pantheon, for instance, which is a cavern style that's totally alien to the form language of the Greco-Roman civilization, but which is quite at home in what later will become Hagia Sophia amongst the Byzantine civilization and the mosques, of course, in Islam. So an example of a successful boundary act would be, of course, the Greeks against the Persians at Marathon and with the 300 and so forth. Or another such boundary act that occurred that was successful was the boundary act of Charles Martel in about 700 against Islam, at least preventing it from crossing the Pyrenees and entering north into France. It was rooted in Spain for a while, of course, down until Ferdinand and Isabella finally pushed it out once and for all. That was a successful boundary. So those are 2 successful boundary acts. The Maccabean one really was not, except only temporarily, as it created, for the first time in quite a while, another self-ruled Hebrew state. Now, with the Romans were on the rise. They had gone through the Carthaginian Wars, and they had beaten Antiochus III, who was the leader, the king of the Seleucids. When the empire of Alexander disintegrated, it broke into 3 spheres of influence, primarily the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Egypt, with the Seleucids in the Middle East, and the Antigonids in the area of Asia Minor, but it was a relatively minor power. It's really a war that goes on and on between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies for control over the Middle East. And so they're constantly going back and forth. And the Romans in beating Antiochus III put now heavy pressure of taxation on the Syrians, on Antiochus, who in turn then put heavier pressure of taxation on the Jews. Now at this time, the high priest of the Jews was Onias III, whose brother Jason, as his name implies, was very sympathetic to Hellenistic culture and began to import, as he was paying all these taxes to then Antiochus IV, Epiphanes then comes in following Antiochus III. He's paying all this money and taxes to them, but he's also importing Greek, part of the Greek pseudomorphosis over the Hebrew world. He brings in gymnasiums. He himself has a Greek name. Greek names become popular. Greek practices become popular. And so he was very sympathetic to the Hellenizers, as was later the one who ousted him, Menelaus, also with a Greek name, came in and ousted him, and he was even more sympathetic. And then Jason had fled into exile and then came back and reestablished his reign, but without so much of a Hellenizing influence, because he noticed that there was a lot of popular discontent with these Hellenizing influences. And so out of this political turmoil, Antiochus IV Epiphanes made the very unwise decision of going into Jerusalem, raiding it, pulling down the walls, raiding the treasury of the temple, taking the money out of there, and then, abomination of all, the abomination of desolation as it's called, reconsecrating the temple of Yahweh to Zeus. An absolute horror to those who were not sympathetic to the rulership of the Syrians, of the Seleucids, the Greek Syrians. And so this led to the Maccabean revolt, starting with Mattathias, and then his 5 sons, the leader of whom was Judas Maccabeus. His name means the hammerer, and who formed Judas, and this is an important point in Steiner's reading here, Judas Maccabeus then formed an alliance with the Romans against the Greeks, against the Seleucids, and then proceeded on a campaign of basically guerrilla warfare. Him and his 4 brothers pillaging the landscape, getting in, getting out, and then the next generation of the Maccabean, there were 5, him and his 4 brothers, and then another generation after him of 7 more Maccabean sons, 12 altogether, keep that in mind, who then successfully, who won basically and reestablished the self-rule of the Hebrews for a while. But then, of course, all sorts of political factions, the Sadducees, who are from the wealthy classes and they're in the temple, the Pharisees, who come from the middle classes, who are sympathetic to the poor, but who read scripture, they study the Torah. The Pharisees eventually become the rabbis. They have that Torah exegetical emphasis. The Sadducees are connected with the priesthood of the temple, and so forth. And so, but the point of all this is that Steiner thinks that this makes an excellent climax for the ending of the Old Testament. And then, of course, the Mark Gospel is technically the first. They put, whoever has put Matthew in between the book of Malachi and Mark, but Matthew is later, is contemporary with Luke. Those 2 Gospels come next, and then the John Gospel. The Mark Gospel is written by an individual that we don't know much about. His name was Mark, and he wasn't one of the original apostles. He was a disciple of Peter, though. And from a series of interviews that he conducted with Peter, who of course had firsthand knowledge of what he witnessed, we get the oldest of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark, which is written about 65 AD, just about 5 years or so, right in that period before the Romans destroyed the temple finally, once and for all. They go in with the first of the Romano-Jewish wars and destroy the temple and tear it down. It cannot be an accident. And Mark is in Alexandria at the time, but it cannot be an accident that the writing of this first gospel coincides with the heating up of the tensions between the Romans and the Jews that lead to the destruction of the temple, with the Pharisees, who had been tied to the synagogues, local synagogues and so forth, then inherit the rabbinical tradition, and Judaism becomes portable from that moment on. And the Gospels are a sort of portable Judaic account of the life of this prophet, Christ. And Mark wrote this in Alexandria, which was a very flourishing cosmopolitan place. It was the place to be. It was the center of the learned world of this period, of the entire Hellenistic age and the early Roman period. This is the place to be. If you wanted to be a writer and a scholar, and have access to the great library. As the ships would come in to do trade, they would make the ships stay in the harbor at Alexandria to get on board, get all their scrolls, whatever they had, didn't matter what, and give them to the copyists, the scribes, to make copies of them, and you couldn't leave. So you had to do business. So I'm sure word probably got around about this, and I'm sure quite a few of those ships made sure they didn't have any scrolls. Once word got around, the scrolls probably began to get scarcer and scarcer. So this is the milieu that Mark comes out of, and I like his gospel because it's my favorite of the four. Most people prefer the John gospel because it's more mystical. In a way, the John gospel, which is written around 90 AD or so, is much more, it's more like a sort of proto-Gnostic text, whereas Mark is still in the domain of apocalypticism, the Jewish apocalypticism that began with the book of Daniel, which is just about contemporary with the Maccabean revolt, and which brings in Jewish eschatology. They invented the genre, and it's still present in Mark. Mark 13 has a miniature apocalypse in it. But by the time you get to John, and it was clear that the kingdom of heaven was not going to come during this generation, and those expectations were being dashed, especially with the destruction of the temple, then it began to shift to a more inward mystical accent with the coming then of the Gnostics in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And so it shifted from the genre, shifted from apocalypticism to Gnosticism. So Steiner, it's very important, he says, and he talks about how his main idea is that the 12 Maccabean children, the 5 and then the 7, are reincarnated as the 12 apostles. And he says even one of them has the same name, Judas. He says this is the same individual, Judas Maccabeus, who led the revolt in alliance with the Romans, who is the primary figure of this ethnic boundary act, who led the revolt against the Greeks, then becomes Judas Iscariot, who once again has to form an alliance with the Romans, but in this case on the individual plane, because the Christ event brings in the concept of the ego and the idea of individuality now for the first time. With the Maccabees, we get an ethnic boundary act, but with the apostles now, things are becoming individualized. Each of them has a unique personality. Christ has a unique personality. And so now they have to deal with a different sort of karma. And it's not always easy to it's a little bit like getting back into a wet bathing suit. It's not always easy to come out of and the incarnation between them is a very narrow time period. It's not always easy to get back into another lifetime with that karma and then get back on track, and Judas Iscariot did not. But so this is his idea that the 12 Maccabeans are reincarnated as the 12 apostles, which is an idea that I find interesting. Now he starts out, he has some interesting insights about the first few chapters, where he starts talking about how it doesn't have Mark, just as John, do not have infancy narratives. It just begins, and it begins all of a sudden with John the Baptist in the wilderness, and people recognize him, they know him, they approach him, they're going there specifically to be baptized, and then our attention is drawn to the Christ being who appears immediately after him. But the opening words, where he says, "Behold, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, who shall prepare thy way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight," to introduce John, is almost a direct quote, though, from Malachi, which, remember, forms the concluding text of the Old Testament, the official version, which is Malachi 3, "Behold, I send my messenger to prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears?" So it's interesting, Steiner draws your attention to this, that there's even if the Mark Gospel had been put ahead of Matthew, which it should have been, it's the oldest and the rawest and the most apocalyptic of the four. There's almost a nice transition there between Malachi and Mark, even though Steiner believes that the Maccabean, the books of the Maccabees, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2 should have been the concluding text. And I think he's right about that. So he draws your attention to that. And then he says that, notice, so it starts right off with Christ sort of emerging from the water, almost as though he's been underneath it, in the watery abyss, you might say. And then as soon as he comes up, then the Spirit, which Steiner will say is the Christ being coming down from the Son, descends into him. And at that moment, then the Christ being is incarnate and his presence is on earth. And then he says the first thing that he does is to perform an exorcism when he goes to Capernaum. He's in the north, above the Sea of Galilee, with the Jordan. And notice that the story of the Gospels, each one of them follows this trek from north to south, from Galilee down south, which is the way the river flows, from north to south, the Jordan, to the Sea of Galilee, the Red Sea, or rather the Dead Sea, and to Jerusalem. It's a north to south flow, just exactly like the narrative flows, following the course of the river. And the first thing he does at Capernaum, second thing, the first thing he does is he grabs his first 4 disciples, Simon and Andrew. Simon he later renames Peter, and Andrew, who he says were fishermen. He says, "Come, I'll make you fishers of men," which invokes a very old motif. We will fish men out of the waters of ignorance, and they will be reborn in the realm of the Spirit. And then also the Boanerges, which means the sons of thunder, John and James. And tradition has it that this is the same John, which it cannot be. This is an ignorant fisherman who wrote the book of Revelation and also the 3 epistles and the John Gospel. That's a very literary individual who is as literate as Paul. Cannot be the same individual, but the tradition says that it is. So he gathers, notice, these first 4 disciples around him, which sort of form a mandala, right? It's kind of Jungian mandala with these 4 men around him, and he's the 5th point at the center, just as when he gets all 12 grouped together shortly, he's the 13th at the center with the 12 revolving around him, just as Apollo in Greek tradition at the center of a tetractys was the central point around which the 9 muses revolved. And so as soon as he gets this little mandala gathered around him, they go to Capernaum and he performs an exorcism. And Steiner draws your attention to this and he says, notice this, that the demons recognize him immediately. The demon this is some man who's in a synagogue. They recognize him immediately and they say, and immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Steiner says, so just as everyone recognized John the Baptist, men recognized this prophet who was thought widely to be the reincarnation of Elijah and the last of the dying voice of the prophets. And now we have it's the demons who recognize the Christ. They're not Jesus. They're recognizing the Christ being who now has, right from the start of the gospel, taken up residence in the body of Jesus of Nazareth, displacing his Zarathustra ego that had incarnated, that had been transferred to him from the other child, the Solomon child, into the Nathan child. We'll get to that later. So they recognize him as though, they remember him, the Son being, this Christ being from the Son, maybe from way, way back during one of these, the epoch of Old Moon, perhaps, when the War in Heaven took place. I think Steiner might suggest that. He might get to that later. But at this point, he just draws your attention to the fact that it's these supersensible beings, these demons who recognize this Christ being. They're the ones who recognize him, and he casts them out. It's a little bit like in The Exorcist, when the demon Pazuzu was already taken up residence in the girl, immediately recognizes Father Marin, this guy that he's done a previous battle with, maybe in the Middle East, but maybe in prior incarnations all the way back to Mesopotamia, where Pazuzu originates. And they're going to do battle again. So it's something like that. And by the way, that priest, though, Father Marin in The Exorcist, is modeled off of the Catholic priest, philosopher and archaeologist Terre Desjardins, which is a fun point that I enjoy about that film. They specifically had him in mind. And then so it starts this way with this recognition of, Steiner says, note how it just elegantly and very simply starts already on the spiritual plane from the supersensible realm of angels, demons, and archangels already sort of coming down to the earth. Right from the start, it's on an elevated stage, unlike the Maccabean books, which are very anchored and rooted in the earth. This is the realm of men with the Maccabeans and the realm of historical and ethnic conflicts. Now this is a spiritual drama that's taking place that has to do with the struggle for the individuality, the ego, stabilizing from out of the astral world and the struggle that takes place. And of course, most of the miracles that Christ performs in this text are exorcisms. He's constantly fighting these demons as though he's been involved with them as the Christ being from other eons. And then so Steiner draws your attention to Mark 3, where Christ is gathering all the 12 around him. These are the 12 sons of the Maccabees now that have been reincarnated, and he gathers them around him. And he names, notice Steiner says that he names James and John the Boanerges, which means the sons of thunder. So, and Steiner says he does this because he's connecting them to celestial phenomena. They're connected to the heavens. They are connected to the elemental forces that in Steiner's cosmology and mythology are occupied by angels and archangels and so forth. These beings take up residence in the elements, in fire and air and water. They take up residence in these supersensible elements. And so it's almost a way of invoking the supersensible right from the start when he names them after these sky powers. But it could also be, I think of it too as the sons of thunder and the thunderbolt, the Vajra, that is universally used by dragon slayers to hurl it. Poseidon uses a trident, but it's basically a modified thunderbolt, a Vajra, to hurl it at dragons and demons. So it's almost as though the two for him. And later they ask him in the gospel, they say, can we be your right and left hand on either side of you? That's where we want to be. And the other disciples get jealous, which is another interesting image, because that image of Christ in between James and John is very much analogous to the image of Mithras in between the two twins, Cades and Catapates, one of whom has a torch pointing up and one of whom has a torch pointing down, which is, of course, mirrored again with the crucifixion of Christ, where one guy goes down to hell, the thief, I think, and then the other ascends up with him to heaven, which is a direct mirroring image of Mithras with the two twins. I think they're called the Ephors. So there's that. And he says, and notice too how he also renames Simon Peter, the rock, which connects him again with another elemental force. So we have, when Christ is gathering the disciples around him and giving them these names, he's connecting everything with the elemental world. So it's already enacting this super sensible drama in which we've got all these incredible things going on here with reincarnation and karma and a spiritual battle that is taking place that's now on an elevated stage than what was going on with the previous books with the Maccabeans, which are on an earthly stage. And of course, Peter is a rock, the rock that's associated with that which perdures, while the tree is normally associated with that which is temporal. The tree comes and goes, and so Joyce plays with this in Finnegan's Wake, where he's playing with Tristan's name as tree stone, the combination of the eternal personified by the infinite and the temporal, like the sun and the moon do the same thing, connected together in one image, and is in opposition, of course, Peter, Petros, the rock, Petra, in opposition to the Boanerges, the heavens. So he's anchoring himself and creating a mandala around him, and now he's ready to go to war against the demons, which we'll resume next time.